Saturday mornings used to be a sacred time when kids, fueled by bowls of sugary cereal, flocked to their TV screens for a binge-worthy block of cartoon programming. But that was a long, long time ago. And Saturday morning cartoons have since disappeared into the pop culture's past. So, what happened? Well, today we're charting the rise and fall of Saturday morning cartoons. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other TV topics you would like to hear about next. Okay, time to tune into some weird history. The story of Saturday morning cartoons begins in 1949, the same year that brought us NATO, Richard Gere, and the NBA. Hey, something for everyone. It all started when a television producer named Jerry Fairbanks convinced NBC to pick up what would become the first ever made-for-television cartoon, Crusader Rabbit, created by Jay Ward, among others who would go on to produce iconic cartoons like The Rocky and Bullwinkle Show, George of the Jungle, and Captain Crunch. Crusader Rabbit followed the adventures of a heroic bunny and his tiger sidekick, sort of like a gritty reboot of Winnie the Pooh, in which his friends have to avenge him. There was no specific plan to put the show on Saturday mornings when it was made, but according to Fairbanks, the networks had some vague idea that they wanted programs for kids, and research showed that the hours between 10 a.m. and noon on Saturday were among peak viewing hours for the youngsters. You know, because there's no school. Crusader Rabbit, which had very simple animation, ran for 2 seasons before its unceremonious cancellation. It wouldn't be until 1955, when CBS aired Mighty Mouse Playhouse on Saturday mornings, that the Saturday morning cartoon would begin to stick. That show ran for 12 years, and by 1966, all 3 major networks would be airing cartoon blocks on Saturday mornings.
Begun the Saturday morning cartoon era.
Hey, weird historians! Just finished a playlist of history's most epic battles and looking for something to feed your tactical fix? Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus lets you forge your own battlefield legend in the grim darkness of the far future. Tacticus is an exciting turn-based tactical strategy game set in Games Workshop's iconic Warhammer 40,000 universe. Assemble squads of the universe's most powerful warriors to engage in lightning-fast tactical skirmishes where you are in full control. Command over 70 legendary Warhammer 40,000 champions from 17 playable factions and join a passionate community of new players and veteran fans alike as you conquer PvE campaigns and compete in high-stakes PvP, live events, guild raids, and more. Best of all, I can play a full match in just a minute or two, which means I can spread the Emperor's light several times over in a single cab ride. Even if you manage to conquer the universe, Tacticus is regularly updated with fresh content, including new game modes, events, and champions. Fingers crossed for the Night Lords. Follow the link in the description to download Tacticus and use the code HELLOJAN before February 1st for 2,000 gold and 50 Blackstones. And now, back to the video.
When it came to justifying a market for original children's television cartoons, Crusader Rabbit came up, shall we say, a hair short. Since the show was not a runaway hit, no one was in a rush to produce more original cartoons for Saturday morning. So when it came time to design the original Saturday morning cartoon blocks, they mainly consisted of old reruns that pretty much everyone but the youngest kiddies had already seen. Typical offerings came from the classic cartoon shorts of the 30s and 40s, like Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, and Disney. However, what you may not have known is that those cartoons were originally meant to play in movie theaters, and were only later fragmented to fit the television format. Yes, when cartoons first became a part of mass pop culture through the 1920s and 40s, they were produced exclusively for the cinema, as lighthearted shorts attached to the main feature. But this wasn't so much a creative decision as it was a financial one. Given the technology at the time, it simply wasn't cost-effective for a studio to consider making cartoons frequently enough that they could run as a television series. Artists had to draw 24 individual frames by hand for each second of animated footage, and that wasn't cheap or easy. Heck, it still isn't. The rest of the Saturday morning programming used shows initially created for primetime television, including The Flintstones, The Jetsons, and Johnny Quest. Yeah, all 3 of those were primetime shows, like The Simpsons, Family Guy, and Fish Police. Other original Saturday morning cartoon offerings from the early days included shows featuring characters Magilla Gorilla, Top Cat, Quick Draw McGraw, Spider-Man, The Fantastic Four, and everyone's favorite Liverpudlian superheroes, the Beatles. Cell animation sounds like something prisoners do to pass the time. But the cell in cell animation has nothing to do with jail. It's short for celluloid and refers to a transparent sheet that has an image pre-drawn on it, so artists don't need to redraw their characters for every scene. This technique has existed since the early days of animation, but it took a while to perfect it and wound up being a cheap and clever solution to producing more original animation for television. Another key development was when United Productions of America, an animation studio founded by former Disney animators best known for Mr. Magoo cartoons, innovated a style called limited animation. Limited animation further reduced costs by reusing frame elements of a scene, like backgrounds, other than just the characters. Did you ever notice how Scoob and the gang seem to get chased down the same 10 feet of hallway every episode? Well, this is why. Other production companies adopted this process, and it was instrumental in reducing costs enough for animated TV series to become viable. Thanks to limited cell-based animation by the late 1960s, networks could produce completely new 4-hour blocks of cartoons for Saturday mornings. They also found a way to make those cartoon blocks financially viable by mercilessly and relentlessly bombarding impressionable children with totally radical commercials. At long last, networks could finally offer something to advertisers that had never been available before, an opportunity to pitch to large numbers of children for long periods of time, with products made exclusively for them. But it soon became apparent that the whole enterprise could be even more lucrative. That's because someone eventually figured out the commercials weren't the only opportunity to sell stuff. Advertisers started working with networks to produce shows based on products themselves. Shows like He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Transformers, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were essentially created as 20-minute advertisements for their related toy lines that would occasionally be interrupted by commercials for other toys. It's like a magic trick. The only problem was, it was a magic trick performed by toy manufacturers bent on teaching kids who are too young to understand the concept of a fixed income to beg their parents for an endless line of expensive toys. Eventually, the law decided to intervene. Toy makers and cartoon executives were riding high on Saturday morning cartoons for decades. But eventually, parents grew unhappy with how mindless and shameless some of these shows appeared to be. Although we think Shakespeare may have seen the value of Transformers, but parents and activists would have none of it. They spoke out against the colorful cesspool of marketing entertainment created by the TV toy industrial complex and demanded that broadcasters provide at least some educational fare for children in exchange for their lucrative licenses. In response, in 1990, Congress passed the Children's Television Act, which mandated that networks make children's programming that included more educational shows, like maybe a show where He-Man does math. The FCC further strengthened those rules in 1996, stipulating that networks needed to include at least 3 hours of educational programming per week, among other crackdowns. Because networks didn't want to mess with their primetime schedules, they started cutting into Saturday morning cartoon blocks with these educational shows. If you're thinking making Saturday morning cartoons educational would make them more appealing to adults, but less appealing to kids, you're absolutely right. There's a reason those turtles were ninjas, and not members of the debate team. Kids, who perhaps felt like they were getting enough education at school, did not love the change, and Saturday morning cartoon ratings began to slide. As if having to convince kids to watch educational TV on the weekends wasn't enough to deal with, in the 1990s, traditional networks were also facing increasing competition from cable. In 1992, the Cartoon Network launched, further deepening the pool of dedicated children's networks, which by that point already included Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel. The major networks running Saturday morning cartoons were able to fend off these interlopers for a while, but almost immediately after the FCC's '96 educational mandates, cable channels took over as the go-to spots for children's programming. Within a year, Nickelodeon became the most popular children's network. The cable networks were not beholden to the FCC rules, so they could broadcast all the shows they wanted, including the ones that allegedly rot your brain. You know, the good ones. On top of that, the mere existence of such channels had already diminished the novelty of getting up early on Saturday to watch your favorite tunes, because they broadcast kids' programming around the clock. What's the point of Saturday morning cartoons when multiple channels play cartoons all day long? Already under pressure by parents, Congress, and cable networks, the networks probably realized their Saturday morning goose was cooked. right about the time the kids started to turn on them as well. Not consciously, mind you. It's simply that kids' taste in TV shows were starting to change. NBC executive Lee Gaither described the evolution in children's entertainment preferences by pointing out, as cable TV started to rise, kids over the age of 8 started splitting off into very different groups. Network data showed that while some kids were into animation, others were not. Live-action shows made for kids became more popular, and according to Gaither, it had become hard to find a kid who liked animation solely anymore. And whereas cartoons seemed to generally be more popular with boys, live-action shows seemed to appeal to both the tween girls and boys. The long and short of it was that 4-hour cartoon blocks just didn't make as much sense anymore, regardless of how many bodacious toys they sold. The final blow for Saturday morning cartoons would be the same one that knocked the whole appointment television business on its backside: the birth of Netflix. When it launched in 1998, the future streaming service, which at the time just delivered DVDs to people through the mail, didn't offer original programming. It actually just licensed much of its children's content directly from cable networks. But that still took eyes away from TVs, as did Hulu when it launched in 2007. With these services, network programming became even less influential, as kids could now watch whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Adults also started to move away from traditional TV as they turned to streaming. October 4th, 2014 marked the first weekend in America without Saturday morning cartoons since the phenomenon began. We'd like to say that children across the country wore black as part of a national day of mourning, but by that point, no one particularly cared. NBC was the first to do away with its cartoon block in 1992, and CBS shortly thereafter. ABC held on for a while, given all its Disney programming options, but time makes fools of all of us in the end, and ABC aired its last Saturday morning cartoon blocks in 2004. Fox, meanwhile, finally ended Saturday morning cartoons in 2008, leaving the CW the last holdout when it shut off the lights in 2014. Over 2 decades since the decline began. And that's all, folks. For those who don't remember, Punk'd, which aired on MTV from 2003 through 2007, was a reality TV series hosted by Ashton Kutcher, famous for both his starring role as Michael Kelso in Fox's sitcom That 70s Show and for general handsomeness. Punk'd was a hidden camera prank reality series in the tradition of shows like Candid Camera and TV's Bloopers and Practical Jokes, in which Kutcher and his crew would trap unwitting celebrity guests in ridiculous scenarios and film their reactions. Kutcher had originally started work on a series called Harassment, in which he would play practical jokes on ordinary, non-famous people. Despite coming up with a title that perfectly encapsulates the entire prank show genre, Kutcher ultimately abandoned the premise after he got sued for placing a fake dead body in the pool of the Hard Rock Hotel in Las Vegas. Oh boy, Ashton, that is comedy. Thwarted by the laws of both man and common decency, he came up with a new idea. That idea was Punk'd, and the new spin was that the practical jokes would be played on celebrities rather than regular Joes, presumably because image-conscious famous people would be better sports about the whole thing and therefore less likely to sue. The show managed to pull the wool over some pretty famous eyes, including Justin Timberlake, Jessica Biel, Tracy Morgan, Lindsay Lohan, Kirsten Dunst, Hugh Jackman, Zoe Saldana, Kanye West, The Rock, Beyonce, and many, many more. Along the way, Kutcher and his co-producers discovered that pulling off a prank show on targets who are already conditioned to look for cameras everywhere is a lot harder than it seems. They would quickly turn to editing tricks and outright fabrication to get the content they needed. Part of what made Punk'd so memorable was getting to watch celebrities gradually melt down in the middle of an absurd situation. After all, the entire point of a prank show is to capture a person's unaltered reaction to a practical joke, right? Well, not so much. Often, the celebrity target wasn't happy with whatever their natural reaction turned out to be, and did not want the public to see it. And we get it. You aren't going to make the most flattering expression when you're blowing up a wedding or watching the government repossess your dog. In such cases, the raw footage was left on the cutting room floor and replaced with alternate, less embarrassing takes. One famous example is the episode featuring the rapper Drake. Drake thought he was going to meet then Vice President Joe Biden when the Punk'd crew faked an earthquake. In the episode that aired, Drake is appropriately alarmed, but his initial unedited reaction was apparently much more dramatic. According to Ashton Kutcher's recollection of events, Drake jumped and curled up into the fetal position on his friend's lap. Guess we know why that hotline stopped blinging. Fans of the show may have thought Ashton Kutcher personally orchestrated every prank on Punk'd, since he's almost always shown issuing commands via earpiece to the actors carrying out the pranks. But of course, Kutcher wasn't in charge of whether or not a prank went too far. Instead, MTV had a whole team of lawyers providing on-site legal advice as to whether or not a prank should be stopped. As Kutcher put it, the primary responsibility of these lawyers was to ensure that at no point in time were we breaking any laws or endangering anyone in any way. It's a long way to say covering our act. But even with teams of lawyers trying to keep things within the bounds of legal propriety, Punk'd sometimes got dangerous. For example, in Serena Williams' episode, the tennis star bravely drives a car at nearly 100 miles per hour in pursuit of 2 children. Again, super funny, Ashton. Rob Pinkston, who played a teenager in the episode, admitted that they pushed the boundaries of personal safety because he felt like his job was on the line. According to Pinkston, I had Punk'd co-creators Jason Goldberg and Ashton Kutcher in my ear during the bit, and they told us to keep going as long as it was safe. But I think we stretched the safe part a bit. Fooling one of the world's greatest athletes into driving like she's in last place in Mario Kart is definitely considered unsafe by most traffic courts. Furthermore, Pinkston claims that the producers were only concerned that he saved the sketch by shaking Serena off his tail during the chase. When the episode aired, the editing made it appear like Williams was told to drive to where the kids would take it. The entire prank was essentially rewritten after the fact to make it less upsetting and less potentially illegal. The performers on Punk'd claimed they were frequently encouraged to take things too far. For example, Julia Wolof, who acted in an episode of Punk'd featuring rapper Jadakiss, said that producers tried to get her to push Jadakiss to his boiling point, even though they knew he might be armed. Oh, that is genius, Ashton. When she voiced her discomfort to the producers, she claims they told her not to worry about it and just to keep going, which lines up with Pinkston's recollection of the Serena Williams episode. Playing a practical joke means dropping an unsuspecting person into a situation that is jarring and stressful, and it's difficult to predict how they will respond. Some people just roll with the unusual circumstances. Some get flustered or become emotional, and some will become outright violent. The last one is a lot more common than you may suspect. There's an entire subgenre of YouTube devoted to pranks that end in fistfights. In fact, Punk'd dealt with so many near misses that the show had a standing policy. If you see a weapon, shut the prank down and reveal yourself immediately. Why so specific? Someone actually pulled a gun in an unaired episode featuring the Black Eyed Peas. A physical altercation broke out when someone in that group's entourage pulled out the weapon. But that was far from the only time things got nasty. Punk'd often manipulated celebrity reactions in post, especially when the star was painted in a negative light. Nobody wants to watch Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson pummel improv theater graduates for pretending to steal his Escalade, especially not Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. For example, in the episode featuring Zach Braff, the actor actually threw punches when he thought someone had painted graffiti on his brand new Porsche. Rob Pinkston, who played the delinquent teenager, admitted that the star tried to beat him up as he ran towards fellow actor Chris Elwood, who was playing a security guard. As he ran, a terrified Pinkston could feel Braff's swings hitting his jacket. Elwood vouched for Pinkston's story, verifying that Braff did indeed try to attack Rob Pinkston, but struck Elwood's arm instead. To quote Elwood directly, Braff definitely wanted to stomp the ever-living crap out of this kid. To spare Braff the indignity of looking like a violent maniac, MTV cut the punches out of the broadcast, making it appear as though Braff had merely shouted expletive-laden threats at Pinkston. In fairness, "He might beat the shit out of us" is a reaction you should anticipate if you pretend to ruin a guy's $100,000 sports car. Arguably, the most viral episode of Punk'd featured megastar Justin Timberlake, although in reality, he was not the sweet, helpless dude he appeared to be on the show. Timberlake described his side of the story in a 2011 interview with Playboy, during which he revealed that the prank itself, in which the pop star's possessions were supposedly being seized by the IRS, lasted much longer than what was shown on TV. According to him, the 10-minute segment shown on the episode was actually cut down from a 45-minute ordeal and featured a much more aggressive reaction. Timberlake recalled showing up at his house, demanding to know what all these people were doing on his property, and repeatedly ordering them to leave, only with a Tarantino amount of F-bombs. But that behavior, while an honest reaction, was inconsistent with Timberlake's generally clean-cut image, and so it was deleted from the episode. Apparently, JT is only comfortable looking like a jerk in a David Fincher movie. Punk depicts Ashton Kutcher and the gang as brilliant pranksters who could outsmart virtually anyone, wreaking havoc on totally clueless celebrities. But in reality, Kutcher really didn't have a great track record at all when it came to fooling his famous acquaintances. For instance, Kutcher tried to punk Neve Campbell multiple times, but only succeeded in fooling her on the third attempt. Meanwhile, the band Simple Plan proved to be nigh unpunkable after they spotted the show's hidden cameras. Ironically, pranking them required a more complicated strategy than their name suggests. But Nick Cannon was by far the hardest celebrity to punk. The crew reportedly tried to prank him no less than 4 times, with no success. Ultimately, none of the episodes featuring Cannon ever aired, but Kutcher decided to hire him instead, and Cannon began assisting with pranks in the show's 9th season. Another problem was that as Punk'd grew in popularity, their cast became too recognizable to fly under the radar. As a result, the celebrity targets began to recognize the Punk'd crew, even if the show liked to pretend otherwise. In an episode featuring Lil Jon, Ashton Kutcher used some repeat actors to play customs agents who tried to convince the rapper his plane was heading for Ecuador rather than Las Vegas. Lil Jon recognized the actors and demanded Kutcher reveal himself, reportedly yelling, "You can't punk the king of crunk." And before you ever try that on your own, remember, that particular phrase only works when Lil Jon says it. Baywatch star Pamela Anderson, for example, reportedly knew the prank was happening the entire time. In her unaired Punk'd episode, she was led to believe that an adult movie was being filmed in her garden. However, Anderson claims she knew it was a prank the entire time, and some stars were so unpunkable that Kutcher wouldn't even attempt fooling them. For example, Kutcher took a pass on punking notorious master prankster George Clooney after Brad Pitt warned him against it. While we can't argue with the logic of doing whatever Brad Pitt tells you, it's a shame we were robbed of the chance to see George Clooney turn the tables on the early aughts' most famous goofball. Though it finished its original run in 2007, the producers of Punk'd knew there would always be a market for celebrity prank shows. In March 2012, Punk'd returned to MTV. Only this time, original host Ashton Kutcher was replaced by a series of guest hosts, including Justin Bieber, Bam Margera, Tyler the Creator, and Miley Cyrus, among several others. Following that revival, a 10th season, with new hosts King Bach and D-Storm Power, was produced for BET in 2015, featuring celebrity targets like Michael B. Jordan, Rosario Dawson, and Zendaya. And in 2020, an 11th season aired on the short-lived Quibi streaming service, hosted by Chance the Rapper and featuring pranks on Meg Thee Stallion, Addison Rae, and Lil Nas X. It's hard to say if we've really seen the last of Punk'd, but we can hope. But if you happen to be a celebrity, it might be a good idea to keep an eye out for hidden cameras. You know, more than usual. In 1986, NASA was high on its biggest PR moment since the moon landing. The organization was going to send a civilian schoolteacher named Christa McAuliffe into space. She would be accompanying a team of 6 trained astronauts and broadcasting a pair of lessons back down to Earth while in orbit. People around the world were eager to see this historic achievement live before their eyes. A normal person being able to go into space seemed like a massive step forward for humanity. Tragically, millions watched on television as the Challenger rocket suffered a catastrophic failure and exploded seconds after liftoff, obliterating the shuttle and its entire crew, including McAuliffe. The disaster crushed public enthusiasm for the space program, and it remains one of the most infamous live broadcasts in history. In 2015, reporter Allison Parker and her cameraman Adam Ward, working near Roanoke, Virginia, were interviewing Vicki Gardner, an executive director of the local Chamber of Commerce, when an unidentified man suddenly approached and gunned them both down. The entire shocking crime was broadcast live. The perpetrator was Vester Lee Flanagan II, who used to work as a reporter for Roanoke's CBS affiliate before being fired in 2013 for inappropriate conduct. Flanagan took the lives of Parker and Ward as revenge for what he felt was mistreatment by the broadcast company. Vicki Gardner, the interview subject, was hit in the crossfire, but she survived her injuries. A manhunt ensued, with Flanagan leading authorities on a 2-mile pursuit before driving his truck off the road and fatally shooting himself. As the televised crime was committed, a document written by Flanagan surfaced on ABC News. In it, he claimed to be inspired by similar acts of violence and insisted he was the victim of discrimination by his former employers, calling himself a human powder keg. just waiting to go boom. Christine Chubbuck, a newscaster in Sarasota, Florida, ended her broadcast on July 15, 1974 by saying, "In keeping with the WXLT practice of presenting the most immediate and complete reports of local blood and guts news, TV40 presents what is believed to be a television first, in living color, an exclusive coverage of an attempted." Then she drew a pistol and used it on herself, live on air. According to sources close to the family, Chubbuck endured a lengthy battle with depression and ideation of self-harm, and had made a previous attempt on her own life 4 years earlier in 1970. Chubbuck's mother chose not to notify WXLT's management of her daughter's struggles because she feared Christine would be fired. A few days before the fatal broadcast, Chubbuck hosted a party with her co-workers. Sportscaster Craig Sager said, "She was having a great time. That was her going-away party, and it was her chance to say goodbye to everyone. But of course, we didn't realize it at the time." In 2016, separate filmmakers released 2 movies about the incident, Christine and Kate Plays Christine, both of which chronicle Chubbuck's deteriorating condition in the time leading up to the tragedy. Robert Bud Dwyer was the treasurer of Pennsylvania from 1981 through 1987, until he became embroiled in a series of scandals and was ultimately convicted of corruption. On January 22, 1987, the day before his sentencing and facing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines and potentially 55 years in prison, Dwyer called a press conference. He gave a rambling 30-minute speech proclaiming his innocence and insisting he was the victim of a widespread conspiracy within the Justice Department to destroy his career. Near the end of his remarks, he suddenly said something uncharacteristically ominous. "Please leave immediately if you have a weak stomach or mind, since I don't want to cause physical or mental distress. Goodbye to you all on the count of 3. Please make sure that the sacrifice of my life is not in vain." Then Dwyer withdrew a pistol from a manila envelope and shot himself. The act was broadcast live to numerous Pennsylvania TV stations, with Press Secretary James Horshaw pleading for the camera operators to leave the room immediately and show a little decorum. Despite his efforts, the graphic and upsetting event was recorded by multiple sources. Videotaped copies were widely circulated, and Dwyer's dramatic final moments briefly became part of the zeitgeist. Filter's 1995 hit, "Hey Man, Nice Shot," is a direct reference to the event, and Kurt Cobain was known to watch his copy of the tape obsessively. In 1998, Daniel V. Jones, an HIV-positive maintenance worker from Los Angeles, parked his truck in the middle of an interstate and unfurled a banner that said, "HMOs are in it for the money. Live free, love safe, or die." The SWAT team arrived with news helicopters in tow and attempted to negotiate with Jones, unsure of what the man would do next, or if this standoff was simply an act of protest. But then, as the police and countless others on live TV watched in shock, Jones lit himself ablaze before ultimately ending his life with a firearm. This final dramatic act of protest was aired live on countless TV stations, even interrupting many afternoon cartoon blocks. Before his final act, Jones threw a videotape onto the freeway. The authorities viewed it, finding footage of Jones explaining his actions and protesting the immense pain and social stigma he faced as a result of his HIV diagnosis. Jones reportedly claimed that the disease was affecting his neurological system and that he had no desire to wait around to lose his mind. 2 helicopters collided in the Phoenix, Arizona sky in 2007. 2 helicopters from different news stations, pilot Craig Smith and photographer Rick Krolak were in a Channel 15 chopper, while pilot Scott Bowerbank and photographer Jim Cox were flying with Channel 3, were urgently following a police pursuit as it unfolded. In their efforts to keep up with the action, the 2 pilots somehow wound up in each other's path, resulting in a mid-air collision that claimed the lives of all 4 men. After the deadly accident, the families of Smith and Bowerbank filed wrongful death lawsuits against all parties involved, but these suits were all dismissed. The National Transportation Safety Board ultimately ruled that the pilots themselves were at fault for failing to see each other before the collision. In 1960, Japanese right-wing nationalist Otoyo Yamaguchi stormed a live televised political debate featuring Socialist Party chairman Inijiru Asanuma and attacked him with a traditional wakizashi, or short sword, before being subdued. Asanuma succumbed to his wounds minutes later. Yamaguchi was carrying a notebook explaining his motivations. It read in part, "Although I bear no grudge against you as an individual for the stances you have taken in your role as leader of the Socialist Party, I cannot grant you forgiveness. words, I shall hereby become the instrument that brings down heaven's judgment upon you. Lee Harvey Oswald was easily the most hated man in America after taking the life of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 during a fateful motorcade parade in Dallas. However, when the infamous Zapruder film captured footage of the historic tragedy, it was not actually broadcast on television. The same couldn't be said for Oswald's fate. While Oswald was being transported between prisons, Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner with ties to organized crime, leapt from a crowd that had gathered around the notorious assassin and shot Oswald at point-blank range while news cameras were rolling. Several now iconic photographs of the shooting even ran in newspapers the following day. It's a live moment that would launch 1,000 more conspiracy theories, on top of the ones that already surrounded JFK's death. Was Ruby acting alone? Was he operating as an agent of the mob? What were his ties to the Kennedys? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. In 1997, two men robbed a North Hollywood, California Bank of America with a genuine arsenal of firepower. As the world watched on television, they engaged in a shootout with police that injured 11 police officers and 7 innocent bystanders, and ended with both thieves fatally shot. The incident was quickly dubbed the Battle of North Hollywood. The two suspects, Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Mataserano, had perpetrated one of the most dramatic robberies ever recorded. During the entire standoff, somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 bullets were exchanged between the gunmen and police, as news cameras recorded every second. Before Sean Nelson was rampaging through the streets of San Diego in a stolen tank, he was an Army vet, a plumber, a crystal meth addict, and the possible host of an undiagnosed mental problem. After stealing a tank from a National Guard armory, Army veteran Sean Nelson led police on a 23-minute televised chase through the streets of San Diego, demolishing hundreds of thousands of dollars of property as he drove the armored vehicle through entire buildings. Nelson had found work as a plumber after the military, but was struggling with addiction, and it's been theorized that he likely had other mental health issues that were going untreated. Every moment of Nelson's shocking rampage was broadcast on television, as news helicopters followed the stolen tank. The chase finally came to an end when a police officer climbed onto the tank and fired into the hatch, fatally striking Nelson. Nelson's motivations remain a mystery, although some observers noted that Nelson just wanted to get the utilities and cause as much damage without hurting people.
You couldn't ask for a better last musical guest of the 1970s than David Bowie. Viewers were psyched, but behind the scenes, Bowie was annoyed by NBC's decision to censor a verse in his song Boys Keep Swinging, which says, "When you're a boy, other boys check you out." Not being the kind of guy who enjoyed faceless TV executives meddling with his art, Bowie took action. While performing the song, he wore what can only be described as a giant marionette suit over the front of his body. At the end of the song, what appeared to be a giant, member, but was actually just a rolled-up party blower, emerged from the marionette's pants and began flailing around. We imagine at that point, NBC wished it had just left well enough alone. Led by Lee Ving, the guy who played Mr. Body in Clue, the punk band Fear was famous for their wild live shows where they would attack their own audience with sexist and homophobic slurs. John Belushi was a big fan, and he pulled some strings to make them the musical guests for the Halloween episode of 1981. Ving took the opportunity to taunt the New York crowd by saying, "It's great to be in New Jersey," and later chanting, "New York sucks." The band's set was cut short after a mosh pit on stage got out of control, but the real damage came after the cameras shut off, when Fear and their fans reportedly caused $200,000 worth of damage to the studio. Surprising no one, the band was permanently banned from SNL. It may seem silly now, but on October 15, 1988, SNL's Nude Beach skit, written by then SNL writer Conan O'Brien and featuring host Matthew Broderick, was hella controversial. Why? Well, the skit found Broderick visiting his first nude beach with a friend. After meeting some fellow beachgoers, the men comment on the size of Broderick's member, ultimately using the word penis over 40 times in the 4-minute sketch, an average of more than once every 6 seconds. That's a lot of wang. The skit generated thousands of written complaints at the time it aired. However, unlike some of the other segments in this episode, the sketch is still easy to find online. NBC apparently didn't feel the need to hide this nude beach from the public. Back in the 1990s, stand-up comic Andrew Dice Clay was white hot and at the top of his fame. but his material was controversial. Clay portrayed a misogynistic, homophobic jerk on stage, but his critics argued it was difficult to tell whether he was truly playing a character or just engaging in hate speech. The fact that he was hosting SNL on May 12, 1990 created a backlash even before the episode aired. Cast member Nora Dunn decided she didn't want to engage with Clay's comedy, whether it was a character or not, and she refused to appear in the episode. Dunn's decision was met with both support and derision, but NBC at least partly shared her concerns. The network required a rare 5 to 7 second delay on the live program, just in case the Dice Man went off script. But to his credit, Dice was a game host, and he performed without incident, poking fun at both his image and the controversy. Easily, the biggest controversy to ever befall SNL came on October 3, 1992. Sinead O'Connor was the musical guest, and at the last moment, before dress rehearsal, she announced that rather than her originally planned set, she instead wanted to sing an a cappella version of Bob Marley's War. Her goal, she said, was to bring attention to child abuse, so she asked that a camera zoom in on her hands at the end of the performance to show a photograph of children. Dress rehearsal went smoothly, and the ending photo packed an emotional punch. When the time came for the live show, the crew followed the same routine, but this time, O'Connor didn't have a photo of children. This time, she held a photo of Pope John Paul II. She then tore up the photo while saying, "Fight the real enemy." No one applauded, and even backstage, O'Connor later recounted that everyone, including her manager, had fled in order to avoid her. On December 5, 1992, during the popular Wayne's World sketch, Mike Myers and Dana Carvey presented a list of the most exciting things about Bill Clinton winning the presidential election. Among those was the president's 12-year-old daughter, Chelsea, whom they described as a babe in waiting. It was weird. The backlash was swift, and the inappropriate joke was edited out of the show's rebroadcasts. Even today, the clip of the joke is currently unavailable in NBC's vault of SNL footage. As a comic who wasn't afraid to push the limits of good taste, Martin Lawrence wasn't a guy you really wanted going off script. That, however, didn't stop him from deciding to try out some new jokes during the taping of his SNL monologue on February 19, 1994. The new material was mostly about John Bobbitt, whose unique assault by his wife Lorena made him common fodder for late-night hosts at the time. The rest of Lawrence's routine, however, was about his opinions on feminine hygiene, which went over less well. The worst parts of the monologue were edited out of repeats and replaced with an on-screen summary of what was said. Lawrence has never been invited back. In a moment that would live in YouTube infamy forever after, Oscar winner Adrien Brody spontaneously donned fake dreadlocks and attempted to speak Jamaican patois when introducing the musical guest, reggae singer Sean Paul, on the May 10, 2003 episode of SNL. It's what the kids call cringe. Brody said things like, "Respect all respect. My auntie. Respect all aspect. Respect me neck. Respect me knees. Big up Jamaica Massive. Big up Kingston Massive." And no, I'm not going to do the voice. The cast and crew could only watch in embarrassment, and Brody, not surprisingly, hasn't been back to host since. Life moves pretty fast. For example, on October 23, 2004, musical guest Ashlee Simpson sang her first song, Pieces of Me, and it went well. Her second song, however, was a different story. Simpson was set to perform her song Autobiography, but instead the music for Pieces of Me came over the speakers once again. Her band tried to recover by quickly shifting to Pieces of Me, but then Simpson's pre-recorded voice also came through the speakers, and she obviously wasn't singing, leaving the audience wondering what in the Milli Vanilli was going on. Clearly embarrassed, Simpson did a little jig and then walked off stage. The moment received huge press coverage, and though Simpson insisted a doctor had instructed her not to sing due to a throat issue, her musical career never fully recovered. Jokes at the expense of people with disabilities used to be fairly common on television. But by 2007, that had rightly gone out of style, for the most part. But on February 24th of that year, SNL aired a sketch in which a character played by Bill Hader made a bizarre, off-color comment about his father, saying, "I remember we had this one great day at the park. We just had so much fun. He was running in the grass and chasing squirrels. They had this fountain and we threw pennies in it for hours. So great. It was the first day that I ever thought to myself, I have a dad, and not, I have a dad with Down syndrome." The audience laughed, but viewers at home quickly took offense. and the CEO and chair of the National Down Syndrome Society ultimately drafted a letter to producer Lorne Michaels excoriating him for the sketch. With the possible exception of a certain Oscar-nominated performance, it's rarely a good idea for white performers to work in blackface, as the practice has a long history steeped in racism. Nonetheless, on the March 11, 2000 episode of SNL, Jimmy Fallon donned dark makeup to impersonate his friend and fellow cast member Chris Rock. The sketch didn't make any major waves when it aired, but backlash arose in 2020 after the video resurfaced online. Fallon, by then the host of The Tonight Show, dedicated an episode of his show to apologizing for the incident. However, he has yet to apologize for the movie Taxi. When SNL announced Kanye West as their musical guest for the episode of September 29, 2018, some people assumed that the famously tempestuous star might stir up some controversy. Those people were correct. West refused to remove his pro-Trump MAGA hat, even after the crew specifically asked him to take it off. Then, after one of his songs, and during a commercial break, he remained on stage and gave a pro-Trump speech, which drew boos from the audience. He then gave a baffling performance dressed as a water bottle. All in all, some pretty strange stuff, even for Kanye. On the episode of October 7th, SNL decided to poke some fun at a well-known series of Safelite commercials by reimagining the helpful windshield repair technicians as top-shelf creeps. The sketch featured Beck Bennett as a Safelite technician purposefully breaking a customer's windshield in order to hit on her teenage daughter. Audiences were generally unenthused, and Safelite was understandably more than a little upset. NBC did its best to scrub the video from the internet and replaced the segment in reruns with a previously unaired sketch. Making fun of a person's disability isn't a great look for a comedian, but it's doubly bad when the person also happens to be a veteran. During the Weekend Update segment of November 3, 2018, Pete Davidson played a character who was very uninformed about the then upcoming election. In response to a photo of the congressional candidate Dan Crenshaw, who wears an eye patch, Davidson joked, "You may be surprised to hear that he's a congressional candidate from Texas and not a hitman in a porno movie. I'm sorry, I know he lost his eye in war or whatever." In the comedian's defense, he was playing an ignorant character, and the joke was meant to be on him. But the "lost his eye in war or whatever" comment was a bridge too far for most viewers, because Crenshaw is a Navy veteran who lost his eye in an explosion while serving in Afghanistan. It didn't sit well with many, and SNL quickly ran damage control by inviting Crenshaw on the show the following week to poke fun at Davidson and bury the hatchet.
Pop star JoJo, real name Joanna Noel Levesque, released her debut single, Leave, Get Out, when she was still just 13 years old, making her the youngest solo artist in history to top the U.S. Billboard Mainstream Top 40 chart. Sadly, Rebecca Black did not reach the same heights. With so much success at such a young age, you'd probably think JoJo was earning Culkin money and had a pretty nice place to call home. Except when she debuted her episode of MTV Cribs, the tween-aged pop star actually didn't live in a home at all. She later admitted that she and her mother had been living out of suitcases and staying mostly in hotels at the time. Instead of rushing to snag a luxury condo at a police auction in time for the taping, JoJo borrowed her uncle's house. According to the star herself, "That wasn't my house. That wasn't my stuff. When I was sitting on the spinny thing, that was his kids." JoJo would eventually recall the whole experience as being ridiculous. The singer regretted the decision, saying, "I should have bawled harder and been like, 'Welcome to my crib. Look at how luxurious it is.' And I should have rented out a place. But no, I just used my uncle's crib. So that was me lying on Cribs." You have to question the wisdom of MTV Cribs doing an episode about a 13-year-old in the first place. The tour of a middle school bedroom might make great television, but not for any of the reasons MTV would have wanted. Ja Rule is known for being a famous rapper, as well as getting smoked by Vin Diesel and Paul Walker in the first street race ever featured in a Fast and Furious movie. He probably owned a pretty impressive house in the early 2000s, but you wouldn't know it from his appearance on Cribs. For whatever reason, the rapper decided to rent a mansion for the weekend and passed it off as his own when MTV started rolling their cameras. That would be bizarre enough on its own, but Ja made a mess of the situation. Literally. He was eventually sued by the actual owner in 2004 for trashing the property and for letting MTV film there without permission. Luckily, Ja Rule got his act together in time to put together the Fyre Festival. British pop star Robbie Williams had quite the career. He scored 7 #1 singles in the UK, and 11 of his 12 studio albums have reached #1. In fact, he made 6 of the top 100 biggest-selling albums of all time in the UK. He also has a collection of some of the worst tattoos in recorded history. He was the Ben Affleck back tattoo of the aughts. The point is, Williams could definitely afford an extravagant home. And on his episode of MTV Cribs, he indeed showed off some undeniably impressive celebrity digs. But those digs just so happened to belong to a different celebrity. The true owner of the home Robbie tried to pass off as his own was Jane Seymour, star of Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. Maybe he's just a really big fan. Robbie Williams is far from being the only pop star who tried to pass off a different celebrity's home as his own. Take, for instance, Dame Dash. In his episode of Cribs, he showed off a truly impressive abode right in the heart of London's Chelsea area, which boasts some of the world's most expensive real estate. It made great viewing for your average MTV watcher, but for those in the know, it was suspicious. The music mogul was suffering from some major financial problems at the time. In 2010, Dash lost 2 Tribeca lofts to foreclosure and reportedly had $7.3 million left on the mortgages. In 2013, he claimed he was $100,000 behind on rent in his Carmel, New York mansion. What landlord lets you get $100,000 behind on rent? Somebody's asleep at the wheel. So how is it that he managed to afford a luxury home in Chelsea? Rumor is he rented it from Mariah Carey. Speaking of Mariah, her episode of Cribs stirred up some controversy as well, but not for the reasons you might think. Mariah Carey broke onto the scene in the early 1990s and became the first artist to have her first 5 singles reach #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, including Emotions and Vision of Love. With a career few could hope to ever rival, she has amassed a fortune, as well as some extremely nice houses, including the one she allegedly rented to Dame Dash. Unsurprisingly, her Cribs episode is one of the most watched in history. The insanely lavish home, which boasted 17 floors and houses a piano that once belonged to the legendary Marilyn Monroe, is 100% real and 100% Mariah's. She also makes some 100% Mariah claims. During the episode, she says some strange and occasionally outlandish things, such as insisting she has only used her shower once and has trained her pet fish to be nocturnal in order to match her schedule. I mean, if you can train fish to do something, is that what you train them to do? Swim at night? Some have since speculated that she made those things up, either to lean on the show's over-the-top format or to have some fun by trolling her fans a bit, or maybe a little of both. But the claims could also have been completely genuine. After all, Mariah is a Streisand-level diva. For example, the pop icon famously revealed on her Instagram, and in subsequent interviews, that she gave birth to her twins while listening to a playlist of her own music. It's understandable. She's got some great tunes. Narcissist. So honestly, it's not that hard to believe she makes her fish stay up all night and works out in high heels. You do things a little differently when you've been a world-famous pop star your entire adult life. In February of 2003, rapper 50 Cent released the album Get Rich or Die Tryin'. Hailed by AllMusic as the most hyped album debut by a rap artist in a decade, the title suggested that the artist was rolling in cash, or at least soon would be. After all, he made a movie of the same name in 2005 that never got a sequel, and he's clearly still very much alive. The star of the hit video game 50 Cent, Blood on the Sand, perpetuated his high roller image in his appearance on MTV Cribs, in which 50 showed off his lavish collection of sports cars, which included 3 Ferraris. However, later developments would call into question whether those cars were actually his. By some estimations, 50 Cent had already amassed a fortune of $30 million at that point, and if so, he could have easily afforded the cars if he wanted them. Nonetheless, in his 2015 bankruptcy filing, the rapper made it clear that he was only renting the lavish cars he often touts as his own. No judgment, 50 Cent. Everybody has to stop by a rent-a-center at least once in their life. 50 Cent isn't the only one who didn't actually own his impressive car collection. The rapper Birdman, whose real name is Brian Christopher William, is the founder and CEO of Cash Money Record, as well as the guy who discovered Lil Wayne. During his appearance on MTV Cribs, he showed off a gorgeous 1972 Chevy Phantom donk conversion that did not belong to him in any way that ownership is traditionally defined. Turns out it was merely on loan for his episode. The car reportedly belonged to a Cincinnati business owner. but it went along with Birdman's image at the time, so MTV arranged for him to borrow the vehicle for the episode. Shad Moss, better known as Bow Wow, and once upon a time as Lil Bow Wow, is no stranger to bending the truth. In 2018, the rapper got himself into some hot water over when he posted a stock photo of a private jet on Instagram and claimed it as his own. You really need to learn about reverse image searches if you're gonna lie on the gram. So it probably isn't a huge surprise to learn that Bow Wow also misled viewers about his car collection on Cribs. The then 21-year-old rapper showed off his Bentley, Lamborghini, and Cadillac Escalade. But much like 50 Cent and Birdman's wheels, the cars were reportedly rented for the occasion. How do we know? Well, each car was emblazoned with the word Prestige, the name of a luxury rental car company in Miami. Oh boy, you gotta start paying attention to those tiny details. Back in the early 2000s, when Destiny's Child was enjoying massive mainstream success and Beyoncé was on her way to becoming one of music's biggest icons, the whole group actually lived together in a house in Houston, Texas. At least, that's what MTV Cribs would have you believe. While it's hard to tell if this slumber party fantasy was actually true, what fans do know is that the group used its appearance to shill for Candy's shoes. Beyoncé took cameras into Kelly Rowland's room, where she uncovered a Candy shoebox filled with mementos from old boyfriends. Destiny's Child got an endorsement from the company at the time and their own line of designer shoes. At the very least, you kinda have to respect that hustle. When it came to producing Cribs, the belief seemed to be that audiences wanted to see their celebrity heroes living outlandish, over-the-top lifestyles, like Richie Rich once he got old enough to fire his business manager. And while that was undeniably an element of the show's appeal, it didn't always produce the most memorable episodes. Sometimes the unvarnished truth is way more entertaining. For example, Redman's episode of Cribs emerged as one of the most popular episodes of all time, precisely because it made no attempt to maintain a fake image of celebrity glamour. Rather, it completely turned the show upside down. Redman's small Staten Island home looked like a college dorm room explosion. It was cramped and cluttered, littered with dirty laundry, and didn't even have a working doorbell. When cameras showed up, Redman was wrapped up in a blanket, and his cousin was still asleep on the floor. Celebrities, they are just like us. MTV was less than pleased, and tried to convince the rapper to rent a more extravagant home instead, but he refused. Instead, he enthusiastically gave a tour of his home, as though it were any other episode, albeit with a twinkle of chaotic glee in his eye. When you watch that segment, it's clear he's having fun skewering the show's trademark decadence. The episode wound up being one of a kind, and opened a few viewers' eyes to the manipulative tactics employed by reality television. As for Redman, he would later explain that he tried moving to a more affluent neighborhood but found himself getting harassed by police too often, and just felt more comfortable in his modest digs. And as of 2017, he still lives there. In an interview with Hot 97, he said, "I wouldn't know what to do with a big house." Although hopefully he started keeping his cash someplace secure, like under a mattress. In an alternate reality, we would all be watching a show called Woozle Rock. Before the show was too far into development, the Fraggles were supposed to be called Woozles. The Woozle plan was changed once somebody watched Winnie the Pooh and heard the Heffalump and Woozle song for the first time. Woozle World was also the original name of the 70s television show The Great Santa Claus Switch, which, interestingly enough, featured characters called Frackles. The name Fraggles was eventually decided on with no particular meaning attached to it, because those tend to be the easiest words to trademark. While the theme song and the title indicate that this is a program about Fraggles, there are actually 4 separate communities interconnected throughout the caves of the titular Fraggle Rock. The human world is known as outer space. That's the outermost layer where Sprocket the dog and humans like Old Man Doc, the Fraggle viewers at home, and George Clooney live. Fraggle Rock is home not just to the Fraggles, but also to the Doozers, tiny green creatures who love to be the work-oriented counterpart to the dancing Fraggles. Seems like a crap deal for the Doozers, but they love it. And finally, there is the Royal Gorg Kingdom, home to the Gorg family, the self-proclaimed rulers of the universe and occasional foils to the Fraggles. All of these communities work together to survive. The Fraggles grow radishes with water from the human realm and are guarded by the Gorgs. The Fraggles use the radishes for food, the Doozers use them to build towers, and the Gorgs use them to, keep from turning invisible? Listen, it was a weird show. We could be making half of this up and not even diehard Fraggle Rock fans would be able to tell. The connection between the different communities of Fraggle Rock is explored in an episode called The River of Life. The human, Doc, makes a profitable deal that pollutes the water everyone relies on, like a real douche.
This water is contaminated!
But once he recognizes that several ecosystems of charming puppets are being affected by his deal, he changes his mind. Imagine that. The Fraggles in Fraggle Rock looked for wisdom and enlightenment in the form of a literal pile of trash. If that's not a metaphor for the 2020s so far, we don't know what is. Marjorie the trash heap was the wise and matronly counselor to the Fraggles. Made of orange peels, coffee grounds, and wisdom, Trash Heap was able to use her years of experience as well as some telepathic and telekinetic powers to give the Fraggles some much-needed good advice. It makes a lot of sense. When we need advice, we turn to the internet, which is the closest thing we have to a sentient garbage pile. Each one of Marjorie's suggestions comes with an upbeat, bluesy song, making her a character that truly embraces all 5 senses. The bridge between the human outer space world and the realm of the Fraggles was not often crossed. But when it was done by Uncle Traveling Matt. Gobo's Uncle Matt was the connection between universes, sending postcards back to Gobo of all his adventures. The morality of Fraggle Rock was always nuanced, but it was there. Sure, there were classic kids' show lessons like friendship and sharing and kindness and all that stuff. But from time to time, Fraggle Rock would deal with some heavier subjects. For instance, there was an episode called Wembley and the Gorgs that subtly taught viewers about the intricacies of oppression. In the episode, the character Wembley is captured and forced to work for the Gorgs. Instead of threatening Wembley, the Gorgs shower him with appreciation and praise, which only makes Wembley work harder to earn their favor. Wembley drinks the Gorgade so deeply that he turns his friends away when they come to rescue him. He only comes to his senses once the Gorgs attack his fellow Fraggles. Some reflection is done at the end of the episode where Wembley reveals he didn't realize the Gorgs were exploiting him until they tried to hurt his friends. A powerful message for children and anyone about to enter the job market. Speaking of the Gorgs, they're at the center of another episode about the appeal of the Fraggle culture compared to the Gorgs' authoritarianism. One day, Junior Gorg is shrunk down to the size of a Fraggle. After learning the ways of the Fraggles and becoming part of their society, Junior Gorg decides he doesn't want to be an authoritarian ruler anymore. He decides having power over anybody is uncool, and they create a new society. The political messaging probably went over the heads of the children at the time. But hey, a ruling Gorg knocked down to size? I think the kids got it. Musical shows for children starring adorable dancing puppets typically don't confront mortality, and when they do, they tend to tiptoe around it. Fraggle Rock was different. Several episodes deal with the uncomfortable subject of inevitable death head-on. Like one episode, Marooned, where a rock slide traps the characters Boober and Red in a cave. With no way out, the two candidly admit their fears about what is going to happen once they inevitably shake loose their mortal coils. Thankfully, they're rescued before any of that happens, but the emotional and existential tone of the episode was totally unique for children's television at the time. The Fraggles are forced to confront the relentless passage of time once again in an episode where Wembley goes on a hike but gets trapped in a rock slide. Starting to think these puppets should stay the hell away from rocks. Wembley is rescued by Mudwell the Mud Bunny, who nurses him back to health and promptly kicks him out. But as it turns out, Mudwell isn't being a jerk, he's dying, and by throwing Wembley out, he was trying to spare the young Fraggle from having to witness the end of his natural life. Wembley sticks around, and all the young children watching at home get to sit through an excruciating sequence as Mudwell finally slips away into the next world, while a grieving and emotional Wembley looks on. Pretty heavy stuff for a show with a song called Pucka 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 Squeedly Boink. Fraggle Rock was also not shy about tackling religion. They had ribbed the idea of cults in a bit in an episode where Marlin Fraggle tries to start a cult that nobody wanted to join. Poor Marlin. But Fraggle Rock also decided to hone in on evangelical preachers, with their character, Convincing John. Wearing his Sunday finery and performing in high-energy songs, John was able to convince anyone of anything, hence his name. The character's played for laughs, but he demonstrates that Fraggle Rock wasn't afraid to poke some fun at religion. John persuades Red Fraggle to walk around blindfolded, and talks Moki into wearing cups on her hands. What a sicko. Convincing John even gets the Fraggles to stop eating Doozer radish towers. Not because it would inconvenience the Doozers, but because he lied and said that it would turn them into humans. Given the choice between human and Fraggle, you go Fraggle every time. As the theme song clearly states, Fraggles would rather dance their cares away than do anything else, which is another way of saying that they're all basically unemployed. Like some kind of puppet remake of Office Space, which we would totally watch. The Fraggles really only put in about a solid 30 minutes of actual labor a week and spend the rest of their time goofing off and making music, like your college boyfriend. The Fraggles can only afford to live their bohemian lifestyle by eating the radish towers built by the Doozers, a super industrious species who pride themselves on their work ethic. They create towers out of radish dust, which are subsequently devoured by the Fraggles. We're sure these towers are important, but they don't seem to serve any other purpose in the show apart from being ready-made piles of Fraggle snacks. Fraggle Rock was the brainchild of Jim Henson and his company, Henson Associates. The company has long been an innovator in the field of puppetry and is behind the massively popular shows Sesame Street and The Muppet Show. And when you're at the top of the biz, you must stay on top of the technology. That's why the staff of Fraggle Rock had to start getting creative with their tech innovations. One of the best examples is the technology that brought the Gorgs to life. Performers would dress up in the full-body Gorg costumes, while a technician off stage controlled the facial expressions using animatronic controls, like a dystopian Cyrano de Bergerac. Animatronics were regularly used with green screens, technologies which were both in their infancy at the time. While the show may not seem cutting-edge today, it boasted some of the best technology the 80s had to offer. The technology wasn't the only impressive component of the show's production. Most shows are designed with one audience in mind, but Fraggle Rock was designed to be international. While the scenes which focused on the puppets were all done in Canada, the outer space human world featuring the Old Man Doc were filmed in multiple locations and languages. This meant the puppet scenes could be dubbed while also filming separate scenes for French, German, and Canadian versions of the show, giving them each their own unique traits. Aside from the language changes, Doc's job also went through shifts depending on where you were watching. In France, Doc works in a bakery instead of as an inventor. In England, he works in a lighthouse. Not sure why. Apparently they don't have bakers or inventors in England. The stories themselves were unchanged, since the themes were a beat everyone could dance to, no matter where they watched. And remember all the postcards Uncle Traveling Matt would send? The Uncle Matt puppet actually traveled to all these exotic places, but his puppeteer, David Goles, didn't always go with him. Though Goles did spend some time in New Zealand and Australia for a Fraggle Rock special, oftentimes local actors were hired to perform the character. If you think the show was fun to watch, you should hear what was going on behind the scenes. The crew of Fraggle Rock absolutely loved to prank each other once the camera stopped rolling. Legendary voice actor and puppeteer Frank Oz had a phobia of seeds. He found himself doused with his greatest fear one day after writer Jerry Jewell filled his Venetian blinds with birdseed. Jocelyn Stevenson even wrote a prank into the plot of the episode Scared Silly after being on the receiving end of a backstage gag. Before the recent Apple TV revival of the series, there hadn't been much Fraggle content in many years. But artist Ben Folds gave us an incredible bit of nostalgia in 2012. His music video, Do It Anyway, was a collaboration between Ben Folds 5, Nerdist, and the Jim Henson Company to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Fraggles. Almost every puppeteer from the original show is there, save for Dave Goles, who was unavailable for the shoot. Classic Uncle Traveling Matt. However, Goles' voice is still used. For a show that really took music seriously, it was inevitable that this sort of collaboration would happen. Hey, Folds made an album with Shatner. Working with puppets was probably a cakewalk. If you're too young or too old to have watched the show when it aired, Pimp My Ride brought contestants down to West Coast Customs in Corona, California, or Gilpin Auto Sports in Van Nuys in later seasons, to have their broken-down old cars restored and customized with outrageous new features, meant to reflect the owner's personality. In one memorable episode, a 22-year-old film student by the name of Brooke Siegel got a drive-in movie theater projector installed in her rickety jalopy. And while you might be right to question exactly how much use Siegel would get out of such a feature, let alone how she'd be able to drive anywhere with it, the reality of this reality show contestant didn't hold up to scrutiny. As it turned out, Brooke Siegel was not a film student, nor was she 22. At the time she filmed the episode, Siegel was a 25-year-old cocktail waitress. Her storyline of being a film buff saving up for graduate school was completely fabricated by the show's producers. You mean they're not telling the truth on television? Even the home in which Exhibit came to visit Siegel was fake. She revealed that the house wasn't her own, but was rented by the producers because it looked better on camera. Siegel claims to have filmed her reaction to seeing her souped-up set of the wheels 10 times before ever actually laying eyes on it. When she did finally see it, she was anything but excited. She later described the car as Barbie's dream car from hell, calling out its ugly neon pink and turquoise paint job, as well as its unwieldy video projector and popcorn machine. Seth Martino, a so-called candy enthusiast, claims producers concocted the story about him having a sweet tooth and leaving candy wrappers littered about his car. "I know I'm fat," Martino later said on Reddit, "but they went the extra mile to make me look extra fat by telling the world that I kept candy all over my seat and floor, just in case I got hungry. Then gave me a cotton candy machine in my trunk." Martino's experience might be the only time anyone has ever been bullied by a custom car. And when contestant Jake Glazier saw his pimped-out 1986 Buick Century, his reaction apparently didn't make for good television. Glazier later told the Huffington Post that he was given a subtle, intimidating pep talk by Big Dane, one of West Coast Customs' more colorful employees. He claims Big Dane walked him around the shop for several minutes, emphasizing how much work they'd put into his car and how freaking enthusiastic he should be in return. Big Dane's alleged choice of words was much stronger, but you get the idea. Glazier got the idea too, and the world was gifted with his memified reaction. As if threatening him to be more excited wasn't enough, Glazier further claims producers encouraged him to break up with his girlfriend. Their rationale was that a single guy in desperate need of having his car officially pimped to pick up women would make for a much better episode. And that may have been true, depending on whether you think Creepy and Sad is entertaining. While having a cotton candy machine in your trunk or a pop-up champagne bar in your back seat may seem like questionable but fun ideas, the truth is they were only designed to work while the cameras were rolling. For example, the cotton candy machine in Martino's car was constructed without a lid, rendering it all but useless. Unless, of course, you enjoy detailing your car with layers of spun sugar and tons of ants. And the champagne bar, which could have been seen as an implicit endorsement of drinking and driving, was promptly removed after filming. Producers realized that if the car or its owner wound up in a DUI crash, they might be held legally responsible. There's some deep thinking. It would have been hard to deny that they had installed that mobile bar, considering they had done it on television in front of millions of witnesses. In addition to having his 1989 Nissan Maxima outfitted with a useless cotton candy machine, Martino told the Huffington Post that the show also had to remove the bodacious gull-wing doors they'd installed, because the pistons required to lift the doors prevented them from installing seatbelts in the back seat. While that is unsafe, it's a small price to pay for a car that looks like it was part of a massive cocaine debt. Martino also couldn't use the LED lights that were installed in the vehicle's seats, which would get so hot he was concerned they might burn people or start a fire. And that cool-looking robotic arm wasn't hardwired into the car at all, but controlled by a guy typing commands into a laptop just off-screen, meaning it was nothing more than a TV prop. Meanwhile, Brooke Siegel had to get her theater projector removed immediately after filming because it was not even close to street legal. Now you may be wondering why Siegel, Martino, and several other contestants didn't just sell their cars to collectors after the show turned them into flashy, undrivable paperweights. Sorry, chum. Pimp My Ride was way ahead of you. Since the conceit of the show was that contestants were being given their dream car, the producers didn't want these personalized rides ending up on eBay. To avoid this embarrassing inevitability, each contestant's contract stipulated that they were not allowed to sell their cars. Period. However, Siegel found a particularly clever workaround. She filed paperwork at the DMV to officially gift the car to her boyfriend. He then sold it for $7,500.
Action.
According to one of the rules of Hollywood movie making, you only build what the camera will see. Everything else is just a waste of time and money. West Coast Customs took this adage to heart, routinely skipping mechanical issues and focusing on flashy gimmicks like terrariums, CAT scan machines, and barbecue coffins. Yeah, that's right, a barbecue coffin. The mid-2000s were a wild time. Less glamorous issues like broken transmissions, engines, or brakes often got overlooked. So many of the pimped-out cars either wouldn't start or stalled out on the drive home. This happened so often that MTV had a flatbed tow truck on call at all times. Seth Martino claims to have spent $1,700 out of pocket to replace his engine shortly after having his car pimped. Jake Glazier's Buick needed a new muffler, but instead of replacing the muffler, the team at West Coast Customs added a fake exhaust pipe to make it appear that the rumbling sound of the car was actually intentional. That's like going to the hospital for an eye injury and the doctor handing you a pirate costume. And while the show made it seem like these custom jobs were completed in a matter of days, contestants claim they often took months, forcing them to find alternate means of transportation at their own expense while waiting for their dream car. Despite the lies, coercion, and mechanical failures, most contestants look back on Pimp My Ride with fond memories. However, the same cannot be said of those doing the pimping. Mauricio Hernandez, a former West Coast Customs employee, told NPR that during his 5 years working at the auto shop for Pimp My Ride, he would routinely work 60 to 70 hours a week for no overtime pay or benefits, all for below minimum wage. The shop seems to have preferred to hire undocumented workers like Hernandez because they are easily exploitable. They fear they can't complain or report labor issues to authorities because they were employed illegally. In 2014, the United States Department of Labor found that West Coast Customs had violated the Fair Labor Standards Act by not keeping proper records of employee hours worked, coercing unpaid overtime, paying below minimum wage, and falsely classifying their on-site exclusive long-term employees as independent contractors, all illegal practices under United States law. West Coast Customs founder Ryan Friedlinghouse chose not to fight the findings in court and instead opted to pay $157,592 in back wages to employees and $16,830 in civil penalty fines. When Entertainment Scoop asked Friedlinghouse what it took to be a West Coast Customs employee, he indicated the two best qualities were working unscheduled overtime and doing whatever we asked them to do. So that's what an asshole sounds like. Meanwhile, Hernandez told NPR that his biggest regret about working those crazy hours was that he missed out on his kid's childhood. According to the U.S. Department of Labor, West Coast Customs is now in full compliance with state and federal law. But Friedlinghouse wasn't the only person affiliated with Pimp My Ride who ran afoul of the law. In early April of 2010, Pimp My Ride co-creator and executive producer Bruce Beresford Redman took his wife, Monica Burgos, and their two small children on a vacation to the Moon Palace in Cancun, Mexico. Monica was the owner of the popular Zabumba bar and restaurant in Los Angeles, and the family trip was partially to celebrate her 42nd birthday. Unfortunately, that birthday never came. Monica's asphyxiated body was found on April 8, 2010 in a gutter near the hotel. Later that day, Beresford Redman was taken into custody and questioned by Mexican authorities. He was soon released, but told he was a person of interest in his wife's death and ordered not to leave Mexico. Despite having his passport confiscated, Beresford Redman left the country anyway, crossing the border with his two small children and hopping a train to Los Angeles. Which, side note, is not the kind of thing you should do if you're the prime suspect in your wife's murder.
I didn't kill my wife! I don't care!
After a young British couple testified to hearing him and his wife arguing in their hotel room days before the murder, coupled with scratches that had been noted on his hands and neck, authorities issued an arrest warrant, and Beresford Redman was extradited back to Mexico to stand trial. Prosecutors determined several possible motives, suggesting he may have murdered his wife to collect insurance money or to carry an extramarital affair and gain sole custody of their children. On March 12, 2015, Bruce Beresford Redman was convicted for the murder of Monica Burgos and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Beresford Redman has always maintained his innocence. He claimed that evidence against him had been contaminated in police custody and that Mexican authorities, eager to keep Cancun a popular tourist destination, rushed to convict him to cover up the city's rampant problem with random crime. Bruce was released from prison on good behavior after serving only 7.5 of his 12-year sentence. In an ironic twist of fate, the disgraced television producer had a television show produced about him, an episode of 48 Hours, titled Fatal Episode: The Producer's Story. In the mid-aughts, Pimp My Ride was a global phenomenon, launching adaptations like Pimp My Ride UK, Pimp My Ride Baltic, and Indonesia's Pimp My Car. There were multiple Pimp My Ride video games, and spin-offs including Pimp My Fahrrad, the German word for bicycle, Pimp My Room in the Netherlands, and Brazil's Pimp My Feed, in which contestants learn to gain maximum Instagram followers from top social media influencers. It remains to be seen whether Pimp My Ride's behind-the-scenes trouble will eventually eclipse fans' fond memories of what was, at its core, a lighthearted and intentionally absurd show. But for now, rest assured that you've officially been pimped. The birth of the modern reality show, or unscripted series as fancy people with their pinkies in the air call them, dates back to the late 1980s and a major strike by the Writers Guild of America. TV writers at the time were in a large-scale battle against producers over residual payments, the money they were owed from TV shows that had already aired and passed into syndication. See, before every show just wound up on Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or Philo, can we just stop making these services? Both cable and network TV stations would pay for the rights to fill their programming blocks with reruns of older shows.
That process is called syndication, and in general, it is extremely lucrative, which is why writers in the 1980s went on strike to demand a bigger piece of the pie. The writers' strike made a serious dent in the ability of TV networks to develop new shows, because nothing with a script can be produced during such a strike. So executives and programmers started exploring unscripted concepts as a stopgap solution. Now, reality shows still have writers, of course, but as they were a new category, they weren't part of the Writers Guild strike, and were thus available. This early experiment paved the way for reality shows to dominate the landscape of modern television for the past 2 decades. Because they don't require traditional writing along with many other things that go into the typical episode of scripted TV, networks quickly learned that reality shows are relatively cheap to produce. It costs way less to strand a bunch of Melvins on a desert island for an entire season than it does to get the cast of Friends together for half an hour, let alone what it costs to have Jon Snow ride a dragon into battle. Cops was born out of this need for unscripted shows. Despite the show's unabashedly pro-law enforcement perspective, it was released in the late 1980s during a time when public opinion about police was at a historic low, and crime rates across the country were high. But the show's portrayal of real-life cops and their thrilling day-to-day lives on the job instantly caught on with viewers. One of the initial elements that made Cops an immediate hit for the Fox network was its memorably catchy theme song. Jamaican reggae group Inner Circle first released their song Bad Boys back in 1987, 2 years before Cops producers licensed it as their theme music. The song and the show immediately struck a chord with audiences, prompting Cops producer John Langley to purchase the rights entirely from Inner Circle for a flat fee of just $2,500. Probably could have held out for a little more, but what you gonna do? Cops attracted a good deal of controversy over the years. Some critics, namely Dan Taberski of the 2019 documentary podcast Running from Cops, have pointed out the show presents a very one-sided and misleading view of actual police work. They claim the show makes crime in America seem much worse than it is, and portrays the comparatively mundane real-life job of a police officer as being closer to a high-octane action movie. According to Taberski's research, 92% of the traffic stops depicted on the show Cops culminate in an arrest, giving viewers the impression that officers are judicious in determining whom to pull over, and often use this method to locate motorists who are actively engaged in lawbreaking. However, only about 2% of real-world traffic stops actually end with arrests. That's a pretty big swing, and would make a pretty boring show. And while ensuring that every traffic stop featured on the show uncovered a more serious crime may have made for more dramatic television, it could give some viewers the impression that the streets of America are flooded with dangerous felons at any given moment. Additionally, the episodes tend to fixate on more exciting or salacious encounters, meaning that producers often cherry-picked clips featuring things like drug crimes, violence, or prostitution. You know, like all the stuff on scripted shows. Taberski estimates that the violent crime rate depicted on the television show is almost 4 times higher than the actual statistics in the United States. And while police work is certainly dangerous, Cops leans into the action movie stereotype of police officers by making the job seem much more thrilling on an hourly basis. For example, 33% of all encounters featured on the show Cops find the suspects attempting to evade or run from the police, which is far more running than any of these officers are expected to do in real life. Those heavy-duty belts are heavy. They give you a patrol car for a reason. When you consider that the show was on the air for several decades, Cops has an outsized influence on how Americans view the police. And honestly, pretty much everything the average person knows about police work comes from television, either from the show Cops or from fictional shows and movies about cops.
Sergeant, take her away and book her.
Sergeant, take her away. Sergeant Booker.
And Cops is reality TV, a Frankenstein genre that implies it's more documentary than entertainment. Cops so effectively supported law enforcement and brought viewers around to the perspective of the boys in blue that a number of police departments actually encouraged the show to come to their city in the hopes of a PR boost. Just 2 years after the LA riots, which were a response to the court decision that exonerated the officers who beat Rodney King, in 1994, the LAPD allowed Cops producers access to their team in the hopes of rehabilitating their public image and changing the conversation around law enforcement. The same thing happened with Omaha Police in 2014, who invited the show to film in their city following an incident involving the use of excessive force. It's like an NBA star signing basketballs for kids. after crashing his Escalade into the rec center. But it's not just the nature of the depiction of law enforcement that has raised some eyebrows in the show over the years. Taberski also makes the case that Cops producers didn't always do a thorough job of securing releases from individuals featured on the show before they made it to air. His research involved actually traveling to cities where Cops episodes were filmed and speaking to people who appeared on the show, whether as suspects or bystanders. And he found that roughly 1 out of 10 of them had formally agreed to have their image featured on air. The other 9 either denied ever having signed any release, claimed that they were too intoxicated to legally sign, or claimed they had been coerced or tricked into signing. And a few of them might have just had naturally blurry faces. We can't be entirely sure. There have been injuries and even a death linked to the production of Cops, which is more death than you would expect for a typical primetime show. Like Frasier, as far as we know.
But now, I'm dead.
In 2014, audio technician Bryce Dion was accidentally shot and killed by a police officer while recording a robbery in Omaha, Nebraska for the series. That fatal shooting took place during the filming that was meant to rehabilitate the image of Omaha's police force after an excessive force lawsuit. That was probably not the outcome the city was hoping for. A longtime member of the production team, Dion had worked on Cops since 2009. Along with a cameraman, he followed police into a Wendy's restaurant in which a robbery was already in progress. When the burglar fired a gun at police officers, they responded with a hail of gunfire, accidentally striking Dion with their barrage. The burglar's gun turned out to be a pellet gun armed with plastic bullets. Following the tragic accident, the company behind the show, Langley Productions, released a statement vowing to assist Dion's family. Footage from the show has been used in court, and not necessarily in favor of the police. For example, a 2015 episode featured officers in Fort Myers, Florida, who cited a man named Hubert Lee Solomon for failing to use an available sidewalk, a non-criminal traffic infraction. However, while frisking Solomon, the officers discovered he was carrying a handgun, potentially a much more serious crime. Solomon later showed the cops' footage in court, as it contradicted testimony from the officer who conducted the stop. The cops' version of events was very different from what actually went down, and Solomon was able to prove it thanks to what was filmed for television. The case was eventually thrown out of court. As of 2019, Cops was the longest-running reality TV show in history after more than 30 years on the air. The show remained a popular favorite, as well as pulling in millions of viewers and sometimes airing as many as 70 times a week on cable's Paramount network. Hey, we get it. There are a lot of hours to fill in a day, and only so much Yellowstone to fill them with.
Survive another season.
But all that would come to an end in the summer of 2020. Cops was in the middle of its 33rd season when nationwide protests against police brutality broke out across the U.S. in response to the killing of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Rather than sending the crew to Minneapolis to rehabilitate the image of local police, Paramount instead decided to pull Cops from its programming lineup, essentially canceling the show in the U.S. And regardless of how you feel about the show being pulled, not sending a pro-cop show to the epicenter of a national police protest was probably a smart move. However, even though Cops was no longer being broadcast in America, Langley Productions continued to produce episodes within the U.S. for sale in the international market. A new season kicked off for European viewers with footage of the Spokane County, Washington Sheriff's Department in October 2020. And whether you think Cops is harmless fun, misleading trash, or something in between, it's clear the show will likely be around for several years to come. To wit, the show has since returned to the U.S. via the Fox Nation streaming service, where the full 33rd season debuted in October 2021. Finally, we get to catch up on all that Spokane action. If anyone in the world has ironclad job security, you'd assume it would be the creator of a show that has produced dozens of comedy legends and has been renewed nearly 50 seasons in a row without fail. That's like a golden goose laying 2 hours of live comedy once a week for 5 decades. Just put food in his bowl and see what comes out. But in the 2007 documentary, Saturday Night Live in the 90s, Pop Culture Nation, SNL producer and creator Lorne Michaels indicated that the struggles of the 94-95 season almost cost him his job. Critics at the time called SNL dysfunctional and embarrassing, and their assessment was backed up by ever-declining ratings. NBC executive Don Ohlmeyer, who was president of the network's West Coast division at the time, later recalled giving Michaels an ultimatum.
Apparently, his exact words were, "The show has to get better. You're a captain of industry, and that's the advice you give?" I guess that's why I'm not a captain of industry. Michaels, for his part, was scared. He knew he was in danger of being broke and washed up. As a result, he took a drastic approach to revamping the show, including several casting shakeups and a legitimate Saturday night massacre at the end of the season that left many of the show's major performers suddenly out of a job. But we'll get to that in a minute. In addition to the poor reviews and sliding ratings, the 1994-95 season, SNL's 20th year on the air, began on an uncertain note. The off-season exits of Phil Hartman, Julia Sweeney, and Rob Schneider had left some big shoes to fill, especially Hartman's. The famed actor and comedian joined the show in 1986 and became one of its most celebrated performers. During his 8-season run, his impressive range allowed him to take on all kinds of characters, including the vital role of then-President Bill Clinton. If you're doing a weekly comedy show that regularly skewers pop culture in the media, you kind of need someone who does a good impression of the president. Otherwise, you end up with whatever the hell this was.
If you want it, pass it. Whatever, I'll sign it. It's your call. I really don't care anymore.
SNL even acknowledged his absence in the first sketch of the 1994 season, which featured numerous cast members, including newbie Chris Elliott, auditioning to be the next on-screen Clinton. Julia Sweeney was candid about her decision to leave, stating, "Everybody says the show is a boys' club, right? Well, it's everything you think it is, times 100. Schneider would later recall that while he had a great experience at SNL, he simply wanted to take on other projects. For him, SNL was but a stepping stone on the path to Judge Dredd and Deuce Bigalow, European Gigolo. With the exit of Hartman, Sweeney, Schneider, and others, Lorne Michaels brought in emerging new talent like Chris Elliott and Janeane Garofalo. If you just said, "Hey, I didn't know Janeane Garofalo was on SNL," you're not alone. She didn't stay with the show for very long. She struggled throughout the season, feeling the characters she was given were unenlightened and stereotypical. Not to mention, they received relatively few lines. This was a typical experience for newcomers. Veteran cast members got the most airtime, with competing personalities draining SNL of its energy. Observers indicated that the writers' room was mired in a mood of depressed and lethargic burnout. One SNL writer even noted that the cast members couldn't even fake forcing themselves to care. According to the writer, when you watch the show on TV, that comes through. It's sort of like a screw you to the audience. We don't have to be good, because we're Saturday Night Live. Garofalo compared her first few months on SNL to a fraternity hazing. While she felt the experience was ultimately beneficial because it toughened her up, she also admitted it took its toll. She reportedly told friends being on SNL was the most miserable experience of her life, attributing her survival to cigarettes and Stoli. That sounds like a lot of people's jobs, except the booze is even cheaper. Garofalo left SNL in March of '95, weeks before the season officially ended. And she wasn't the only cast member to abandon ship before the final episode. Mike Myers left the show in January to begin his career making millions of dollars off of Austin Powers and Shrek sequels. Although at the time, Myers was still struggling to find footing as a movie star. The addition of new cast members Molly Shannon and Morwenna Banks during the season helped carry the weight of his departure. But that did not make the mid-season exit of one of the show's most recognizable performers any less conspicuous. At the time, Myers called his experience on the show a cross between Love Boat and Das Boot. Ouch. Although, to be honest, Captain Stubing on a German U-boat? That sounds like a fair sketch. Laura Keitlinger, a new addition to SNL that year, had previous writing experience working on the sitcom Roseanne. But the experience of working on SNL's 20th season was very different. She later said, "In the writer's room at Roseanne, you could on each other and everybody would laugh. But at SNL, it gets personal in a hurry." While cast members were also expected to contribute as writers, there was a disconnect between who would and would not have sketches appear on the show. Chris Elliott found that the pressure to write and perform could be bothersome, noting, "If you wanted to get on the air, you had to write some material for yourself." That mercenary approach to writing the show only amplified tension and resentment behind the scenes. Okay. This sketch is about a guy named Chris Elliott trying to get 5 minutes on a comedy show. It writes itself. Norm Macdonald climbed into the Weekend Update anchor's chair for the first time on September 24, 1994. And while he would become one of the segment's best-loved hosts, he was antagonistic, both on and off-screen. His habit of smoking in the writer's room prompted fellow writer Ian Maxtone Graham to shoot a water gun into his face to extinguish the cigarette. Macdonald retaliated by punching Maxtone Graham in the head. If only he'd been as critical of some of the jokes in Dirty Work. Macdonald's dark humor and dry delivery didn't thrill network executives either. He and SNL head writer Jim Downey were targeted by NBC executive Don Ohlmeyer, who didn't appreciate the pair regularly skewering O.J. Simpson and his upcoming murder trial on Weekend Update. Why so much sympathy for the juice? Simpson was one of Ohlmeyer's personal friends. In the end, Ohlmeyer got Downey fired, although he later returned to the show, and Macdonald was ultimately let go during the 1997-1998 season. Lorne Michaels opined that the tensions and animosities were natural. He noted writers may have been dismayed at the fortunes amassed by some performers once they left the show, while acknowledging that the show was apparently being looked upon, even by some of its cast and creative team, the way the network regarded it, as an ATM rather than a learning experience or a creative challenge. You mean like a creative challenge like the Coneheads movie, produced by Lorne Michaels? One former cast member, quoted in a New York Magazine article published during that beleaguered 20th season, felt Michaels intentionally kept the cast feeling ill at ease, likening it to the same techniques cults use. They keep you up for hours. They never let you know that you're okay. They always make you think that your spot could be taken at any moment by someone else. Wow, I just realized I've been in a lot of cults. As morale and ratings declined during the 94-95 season, some of the show's personnel noticed the writing beginning to suffer as well. Bonnie and Terry Turner, who had penned famous sketches like Wayne's World and The Church Lady, commented on the bizarre nature of some of the season's segments. Meanwhile, sketches like Gay Stripper Theater didn't thrill Garofalo, who commented that homophobic jokes were considered incredibly funny. She also wasn't pleased by an Alien skit that included anal probes and the word bitch written across male cast members' chests in lipstick. Garofalo later said she wanted to quit after the first week. Most of the show's viewers at the time clearly felt the same way. However, there were many bright points during the season. Future United States Senator Al Franken continued to appear as Stuart Smalley. Chris Farley's motivational speaker, Matt Foley, remained popular. And the Gap Girls, starring Farley, Adam Sandler, and David Spade as vapid teen girls working at the mall, became a new favorite. Perpetual SNL cast member Tim Meadows saw the 1994-1995 season as the worst year, in large part because there were too many people. From Meadows' perspective, the writers and cast didn't gel, and to him, it seemed like there were 30 people trying to race to the finish line. Meadows, one of the few cast members who survived the culling that took place before the 21st season, wasn't alone in his assessment. Chris Elliott also felt there were too many people in the cast, recalling that he would attend tapings only to appear in a single sketch. However, the show's crowded cast wasn't an issue for much longer. In a move still not completely understood by many of those involved, Lorne Michaels culled SNL's cast at the end of the 20th season, releasing some of its most beloved performers. Chris Farley, Adam Sandler, Ellen Cleghorn, Chris Elliott, Laura Keitlinger, Michael McCann, Jay Moore, and Kevin Nealon were all dismissed. Elliott and Keitlinger had only been on the show for one season, while another cast member, Morwenna Banks, was only on for a portion of the 1994-95 season. In interviews since his dismissal, Sandler has indicated that while he was hurt by the dismissal, it was as much him quitting as a true firing. According to Sandler, kind of quit at the same time as being fired. It was the end of the run for us, and hurt a lot at the time because we were young and didn't know where we were going. But it all worked out. Well, it certainly worked out for Adam anyway. The following season, Michaels brought in a new lineup of talent, like Nancy Walls, David Koechner, Chris Kattan, Sherry O'Terry, some guy named Will Ferrell. As is so often the case with classics, the 94-95 season of SNL is fun to watch, but was decidedly not fun to make. Comedy is a serious business.
Follow the link in the description to download Tacticus and use the code HelloJan before February 1st for 2,000 gold and 50 Blackstones.